The year was 1978. I was 5 years old. I was literally in kindergarten, and I'll never forget my Christmas present. It was the Atari video computer system, otherwise known as the Atari 2600. I couldn't believe it. I had cut my teeth on video gaming with Pong, black and white Pong, as did most kids in 1978 that had access to a TV and parents who were savvy with the consumer electronics of the time. But the Atari was special. The Atari had full color. The Atari had joysticks, which were a foreign concept to most people, not just 5-year-old Doug. You could play games like Combat, which I know, everyone laughs now, Combat. But trust me, in 1978, when all you knew was Pong, Combat might as well have been Elden Ring. It was just amazing. And then hot on the heels of that, there were Space Invaders and Asteroids, all these games. We had that Atari for a couple years, and by 1980, 7-year-old me felt I was the video game maven. And then, sure enough, what comes along? Activision games. Activision games like Pitfall and Kaboom. And let me tell you something. I basically tuned out of the social life that your typical 7-year-old has to dedicate my life to getting 3,000 points on Kaboom so that I could beg my parents to get the Polaroid camera out, take a photo, and send it to Activision in the hopes that 6 to 8 weeks later, I'd receive a patch in the mail. I'll never forget how cool that experience was growing up with the Atari 2600. Fast forward a few decades, many decades later, I find myself looking to reignite those feelings I had as a 5 to 7-year-old. And so I've got into retro collecting, specifically the Atari stuff. And boy, what a rabbit hole that was. There's no retro video game system in history with a wider array of variations of games, whether you think about the labels, the box art, the manuals, or even the games themselves, than the Atari. You had early games that were called gatefold games because the cardboard box opened up like a book. You had the Sears version of Atari. It was marketed exclusively for Sears, but it was the same Atari, just with a different name on it. You had all sorts of different versions of box art for the games. You name it, it's there in Atari. So collecting for Atari can be quite a chore if you really want to be a completionist. Thankfully, I've chosen not to be a completionist, but I've wanted to focus on something that I've been looking for the last 20 years. I wanted to piece together the original Atari 2600 from one of the very first, if not the first, production run that Atari did back in 1977 in Sunnyvale, California. You see, Atari very quickly figured out that it made more sense to, well, offshore the manufacture of the Atari to Taiwan. But the first year or so, Atari manufactured its system in its headquarters in Sunnyvale, California. There are different versions of the Atari 2600 console. We're going to be talking about what's unique about the very first Atari console. It's called the Heavy Sixer. And the reason for that is twofold. Number one, the original Atari systems had 6 switches on the top of the console for power, black and white, because yes, you could indicate whether you were playing the game in black and white or color. You also had difficulty switches for both the left and the right controllers. You had a game select and a game reset. Now, the difficulty switches for the 2 players were actually moved to the back of the console in the later production runs, which most people have. Those are called 4-switch consoles. But those first year or so consoles had all 6 switch settings on the top of the console. The term Heavy Sixer comes from the fact that the first couple 100,000 units that were produced in Sunnyvale, California, had heavier materials, definitely a sturdier, heavier build. The plastics that were used, the enclosures inside with the metal casing protecting the circuitry and all that, it was considerably heavier than the subsequent runs, which used lighter, cheaper materials. So the most desirable Atari in most collectors' eyes is what they call the Heavy Sixer, the original Ataris. It gets more complicated than just saying I found a Heavy Sixer. There are multiple special things that go into putting together a complete Heavy Sixer. So for example, let's start with the packaging. This is an interesting story. The box art of the original Atari 26 console contained a montage of screenshots, largely mock-ups of the games that they had developed and games that they intended to eventually develop, or themes that perhaps they would have games for. The original Atari 2600 box art had a chess piece pictured on the box. Problem was that there was no Atari chess game at that point, and there wasn't even necessarily plans to put a chess game on the market. For some reason, it was just included in the art. Now, there is a lot of different opinions, mythology, lore out there about what happened, but conventional wisdom suggests that someone at the very least complained that the lack of a chess game was false advertising. It is not clear if an actual lawsuit was filed or was threatened, but we do know that Atari very quickly removed the chess piece from that chess piece box. It's interesting that later on in the Atari's run, there was in fact a video chess game produced. So perhaps the first, 100,000 or so of those systems were called the chess piece box systems because there's a little chess piece on the cover art for the box. That is clearly very desirable. So the first thing you need if you want a complete original Atari Heavy Sixer system is the infamous chess piece box. Very hard to find today. If you think about it, that system in that box was printed in 1977. So that's, 45 years ago at this point. When you think about a game system with a box or even a game cartridge with box, the vast majority of those boxes were thrown away almost immediately when those systems came home. So if there was, 100,000 of these boxes out there, maybe 2,000, 3,000 survived the first few years, and I think I'm probably being a little conservative on that. Now you have to think how many of those boxes survived another 4+ decades. That's not going to be many. The second criteria is, of course, the console itself. So as I said before, you want the Heavy Sixer system. It's notable for having curved edges on the front of the console, the heavier weight of the system, the 6 switches on the front of the top of the console, and the serial number sticker on the back of the console typically tells you that it was manufactured in Sunnyvale, California. Great. Now let's get into the tough stuff. The next thing you need are the proper controllers. Well, Doug, there's paddles and there's joysticks. Those are the proper controllers. Not so fast. Here's the problem. There were, like with a lot of other things at Atari, different permutations, different iterations of everything, including the paddles and the joysticks. Let's start with the easy part, the paddles. The paddles hadn't seen a whole lot of revisions in terms of the hardware over the Atari life cycle, but, and this is a little detail, the little sticker on the paddle changed very early on. The original paddles had a little decal that said Atari on them. The subsequent versions that, again, were maybe not a year into Atari, changed to just have the word paddles on them with a little logo on it. So having the period correct paddle controllers with the correct decals, again, another prerequisite to putting together a truly perfect complete in box Atari from the original run. The next subject is perhaps the most interesting, the most discussed and debated in Atari lore, and it gets into perhaps what is, in my opinion, the holy grail of Atari hardware that was made available at retail. Again, we're not talking about prototypes or things that you could never buy in a store. In terms of Atari equipment that you could actually buy in a store, I believe the holy grail is the complete, and I'll explain what complete is in a second, original Atari joystick. It was called part number CX10. It was the original Atari joystick that was shipped with the Heavy Sixers, and then was soon after replaced by a joystick called the CX40. Again, the materials used in the CX10 were a little more sturdy, a little more reliable. The CX40 was a bit of a less expensive build, but it provided the same functionality. The true CX10 joysticks are obviously, therefore, hard to find. The most notable thing that most people associate with the CX10 joysticks is that the word top is missing from the joystick. That was actually added later. And again, you can't blame people. For almost everyone, this was their first joystick. So they added the word top so that people could understand which direction was up. It wasn't clear with the original joystick, so people would often hold them at an angle because it was a square joystick and not understand why the control didn't seem to work properly. But that's not all. Circling back to that joystick is what's called the infamous hex disc. What's the hex disc? Well, in the very first run of the CX10 joysticks that Atari made, they produced a little aluminum disc that's hexagonal in nature, and it laid on top of the joystick. It had the word Atari on it. It was a cool little design finish, I guess you could say. It's set in a little recessed rubber groove on the top of the joystick. It had some sort of adhesive underneath it, but here was the problem. The design of this was clearly flawed because in the vast majority of cases, as soon as you started playing with the joystick, that hex disc would come free and fall off. You didn't need it to use the joystick. It was just a cosmetic piece, a little piece of trim. But the overwhelming majority of time, as soon as you started playing with it for more than a few minutes, the disc would fall off. And of course, as you might imagine, everyone threw the disc out or just didn't care or didn't think to keep it. Maybe a handful of people might have tried to tape it back on or threw it in a bag or whatever, but the overwhelming majority of these little hex disc pieces went missing very quickly. So therefore, you have these Atari joysticks, which were pretty limited in their run in the first place, but then a tiny subset of them may have had these hexagonal aluminum discs still intact on the stick. So the holy grail, at least in my opinion, of Atari collecting is the Atari CX10 joystick with the hex disc intact. And thus, my quest. I decided, a number of years ago, that someday I was going to piece together the complete Atari 2600 system from the original manufacturing run. And I knew that in order of difficulty, the hex disc was number one with a bullet. For years, I would make sure that at every yard sale, every estate sale, you name it, I would examine every old Atari, every 6-switch Atari I could see. Did they have a disc hanging out taped to the system? Was it in a box, a baggie? I probably embarrassed myself at hundreds of yard sales digging frantically through this old Atari that not even the video game resellers cared about. They could care less. But I acted like an animal. And unfortunately, I came up short. I just didn't find anything. Fast forward to a few weeks ago. I was looking online, and I found a regional marketplace across the country that had an estate sale. This little mom-and-pop company. And they had some pictures of items. And one of them was an Atari. So I went. I did what I usually do. I take the picture. I download the picture. I zoom it to like 1,000% on my giant monitor in my studio. And in this case, something caught my eye. It was clearly a Heavy Sixer system, but there was half of a joystick kind of sticking out the corner of the frame in what appeared to possibly be something on top of the joystick. It wasn't fully in frame and it wasn't really clear, but it could have been, possibly. So I kept an eye on it, waited until there was only about an hour or two left, and I put in a bid. And sure enough, sale completes. I'm the winning bidder. I bought myself a heavy sixer. I've been on pins and needles for days. We're going to open the package, and we're going to find out what's in it, and it's going to be interesting. It's the moment of truth. The package is here, and as you can see, it didn't get here in good shape. It really got demolished, and as you can see, it's open. My heart is pretty much as crushed as this box right now. It's going to take a miracle for that little hex disc to have survived this trip from Colorado on a FedEx home delivery van, crushed, bouncing around. But this is what we're here for. We're going to find out our fate. Have we acquired another heavy sixer for our collection, or have we acquired much, much more? Our favorite thing to be met with, packing peanuts. Let's go ahead and... oh, this isn't a good sign. Controllers are just kind of in here. Oh boy. Oh boy. Well, here's the first controller. Now this is, of course, a CX40 controller, so it will not obviously be the one with the hex disc. We'll put this off to the side. What do we have here? Do we have... was there a miracle where perhaps they would have... is there a joystick in here? What do we have here? It's a joystick. Hold on, hold the phone. Hold the phone, everyone. We have a plastic bag inside a joystick. Could it be? Could it be? Could it be? It's a CX10. My God. There it is. Let's very gently remove it from the Ziploc, hoping the disc doesn't become detached now. And there it is. There's a piece of cellophane tape that someone attached to the top of the disc. I'm pretty confident this is the real thing. I can't imagine this being a reproduction, considering that this heavy sixer has, well, you'll see as we go through this, seen better days. So there we go. The disc is, I can feel it, it is aluminum. It is the real disc. It is kind of barely attached to the controller. So there you go. The fabled Atari CX10 controller with the hex disc. We'll take a look at the rest of it. So here we have a second CX10 controller. Obviously it does not have the disc. Here's a driving controller. And here's the original Atari paddles with the Atari logo. And then under here, it's the real deal, folks. It is heavy. You always look just to see. I mean, we'll open this up at some point. It's very, very good shape. Extremely good shape. We'll definitely, when we open this up, you never know. I've heard stories where sometimes the hex disc gets itself into the console. Someone sets the joystick down top of it, it falls through the cartridge area. So you never know. But we have it. That's a genuine early run heavy sixer with a hex disc joystick.